The Duke humiliated his wife at her mother's funeral, not knowing she was pregnant with his heir. Before we begin this tale of betrayal and redemption, tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I love knowing where my stories find you. Welcome, my beautiful family, to today's story. I'm so grateful you're here with me. If you're new to our community or you've been here from the beginning, I want you to know how much your presence means. We're building something special together, a space where stories of resilience, love, and finding worth in a world that often overlooks us can flourish. We're on a mission to reach 1,000 subscribers, and I truly need your support to make that happen. If this story touches your heart, if these characters speak to something within you, please hit that subscribe button. Share this with someone who needs to hear that they're not broken, just beautifully real. Every single subscriber helps us grow this family, and together we're proving that there's an audience for stories about people who bloom in darkness, who refuse to be invisible, who find love not despite their scars but because of their authentic courage. Your support means everything. Let's build this community together. Now, let's get into the story. Rain drummed against the chapel roof like accusations, and Elara Vance stood caught between the life she'd buried and the life burying her. To her left huddled the villagers of Millbrook, weathered farmers who'd watched her play in their fields as a child, the baker who'd slipped her sweet buns when her family couldn't afford them, women whose rough hands had sewn her wedding dress from scraps and hope. To her right stood the aristocracy in their perfect mourning blacks, jewels hidden beneath crape but no less heavy, faces composed into expressions they'd practiced in gilt-edged mirrors. She knelt at the edge of her mother's grave, black skirt soaking up mud and rain, one hand pressed against the wet earth as if she could reach through it to touch her mother one last time. Her copper hair, darkened by rain, clung to her pale cheeks. "My lady," whispered Mrs. Haver, the housekeeper who'd raised her after her father's death. The old woman's voice cracked with more than grief. "You must stand. You'll catch your death." "I am well," Elara said, the lie catching in her throat. "Only, saying goodbye." Arthur Sterling, Duke of Ashbourne, stood 3 paces behind her, tall and impeccable despite the downpour. His dark coat was perfectly tailored, his posture rigid as the tombstones surrounding them. Rain beaded on his shoulders but he made no move to shelter himself or his wife. To anyone watching, he might have seemed the portrait of a dutiful husband attending his wife's grief. Elara knew the truth in the space he kept between them. The vicar's voice rolled across the graveyard, speaking of mercy and eternal rest, of a mother's love and a daughter's duty. Elara heard only fragments. The rain filled her ears like whispers, drowning the pretty words that couldn't change what was true. She was alone now. Completely alone. She remembered her mother's final weeks, fever-bright eyes fixed on Elara's face. "You married him for us," her mother had whispered, fingers clutching Elara's hand with surprising strength. "For the debts. For the family name. But you must make him see you, Elara. Make him see the woman, not just the transaction." Elara had promised. She had tried. For 3 years, she had tried. The vicar's voice sharpened, pulling her back. "And now we return her to the earth, dust to dust, ashes to ashes." The first shovelful of dirt hit the coffin with a sound like finality itself. Elara's throat closed. She started to rise, knees shaking, but her hand slipped in the mud. She fell forward slightly, catching herself against the gravestone, and for one terrible moment she thought she might fall into the grave itself, which seemed somehow fitting. No hand reached to steady her. She pulled herself up alone, as she had done everything alone these past 3 years. Mud streaked her black dress. Rain poured down her face, and she couldn't tell anymore where the rain ended and her tears began. Arthur moved then, stepping forward, but not to her. He raised one gloved hand, and his solicitor, Mr. Pembroke, emerged from beneath a black umbrella, carrying a leather document case that looked obscenely dry and official amidst the morning. "What are you doing?" Elara breathed. Arthur's voice cut through the rain, pitched loud enough that every soul in that graveyard could hear, villager and aristocrat alike. "Our arrangement, Elara, was always conditional. Your mother understood this. The marriage contract specified an heir within 3 years. The rain seemed to pause. The world seemed to pause. 3 years have passed," Arthur continued, each word precise as a scalpel. "You have failed to provide what was promised. Therefore, as of this moment, I am exercising my legal right to annul our marriage on the grounds of barrenness and breach of contract." Someone gasped. Mrs. Heir made a sound like she'd been struck. Elara stared at him, at this man she'd shared a bed with, shared a name with, and saw only a stranger calculating assets. "Now." Her voice was barely a whisper. "Here. At my mother's grave." The timing, Arthur said, accepting the papers from Pembroke, seemed appropriate. "Your mother brokered this arrangement. She is, unfortunately, not here to witness its dissolution. But those who are may bear witness that I have treated you with all the respect your contract entitled you to." He held out the papers. Rain spotted the expensive parchment immediately. Elara looked down at her mother's grave, at the fresh earth already turning to mud, and something inside her cracked so completely she could almost hear it shatter. She took the papers with hands that no longer trembled because she no longer felt them at all. "You will vacate Ashbourne Manor within the week," Arthur said, already turning away, his duty discharged. "Mr. Pembroke will arrange for modest accommodations suitable to your new station. The village, I'm sure, will welcome one of their own back into the fold." He paused, glancing back over his shoulder, and for just a moment Elara thought she saw something flicker in his expression, doubt, perhaps, or something almost like regret. But then it was gone, shuttered away behind the cold mask he wore so well. "I wish you well, Elara. Truly." Then he was walking away, his boots squelching in the mud, Mr. Pembroke hurrying to keep the umbrella over his head. The aristocrats followed like black birds taking flight, scandalized whispers already beginning, the delicious gossip already forming. Elara stood alone at her mother's grave, annulment papers dissolving in her hands, and felt the last thread connecting her to her old life snap. Mrs. Heir's arms came around her, strong despite their age. "Come away, child. Come away from here." "Where?" Elara asked, her voice strange and distant. "Where is there to go?" The old woman had no answer. The villagers closed around her then, rough hands gentle on her shoulders, someone pressing a shawl around her that did nothing against the cold seeping into her bones. They led her away from the grave, from the manor's carriages already departing, from the life that had just ended in full view of 2 worlds. As they walked through the rain, past tombstones older than memory, past the church where she'd been married with such foolish hope, Elara pressed one hand to her stomach, a gesture unconscious and instinctive. Inside her, unknown to Arthur, unknown even to herself yet, a secret grew. The heir he'd wanted. The legacy he'd craved. The son who would one day bear his name. But that discovery lay weeks ahead, in a crumbling cottage by the sea where cast-off duchesses went to disappear. For now, there was only rain, and mud, and the sound of her old life being buried alongside her mother. 3 years earlier, Elara had arrived at Ashbourne Manor believing that gratitude might be enough. That duty could wear the face of devotion if she only tried hard enough. That a marriage built on necessity might grow roots deep enough to sustain them both. She had been wrong about everything. The manor rose from the moorland like a beautiful corpse, all grey stone and leaded windows that caught the weak northern light and turned it cold. Inside, the hall stretched longer than seemed possible, lined with portraits of Sterlings long dead, their painted eyes following her as she learned to walk quietly, to speak softly, to make herself small in a house that had no room for her. Arthur had been courteous in those first weeks, almost kind. He showed her the estate, introduced her to the staff, explained the household accounts with the patience of a man teaching a child to count. She was 21 and terrified of disappointing him, so she memorized everything he told her and tried to become the duchess he needed. At night, he came to her chamber with the same courtesy he showed at dinner. He was never cruel, never rough. But there was no passion in his touch, no warmth in his eyes when he looked at her. He performed his duty as a husband the way he managed his estates, efficiently, thoroughly, and with no wasted sentiment. When it was done, he would dress in the darkness and return to his own rooms, and Alara would lie alone listening to his footsteps fade down the hall. She told herself it would change. When she gave him a child, he would soften. When the estate saw prosperity again, he would smile more easily. When she proved herself worthy, he would see her as more than the money that had saved his crumbling inheritance. But the months passed, and her courses came with the regularity of seasons, and each time she had to tell him there was no child, the distance between them grew a little wider. By the end of the first year, he stopped coming to her chamber as frequently. By the middle of the second, his visits became perfunctory, scheduled like any other estate business. By the third year, he barely looked at her at all. The servants pitied her. She could see it in the way Mrs. Blackwood, the housekeeper, spoke too gently, as if Alara were made of glass. In the way the maids whispered and fell silent when she entered a room. In the way the groundskeeper tipped his hat and looked away, embarrassed by her visible failure. She tried everything. She wore the gowns Arthur's late mother had favored, thinking it might please him. She learned to manage the household with ruthless efficiency, proving she could be useful even if she couldn't be fruitful. She sat beside him at dinner every night, attempting conversation about the estate, the tenants, the politics of Parliament, but his responses grew shorter, his attention more distant, until eventually they ate in silence punctuated only by the clink of silver on china. The worst moments were the social ones. When neighboring families visited, their wives round with pregnancy or trailing children like proof of their worth, Arthur would watch them with an expression Alara had learned to dread. Not desire, exactly. Assessment. As if he were calculating what might have been if he'd chosen differently. Perhaps you should see a physician, he said once, after Lady Pemberton had left with her 3 rosy-cheeked daughters. They were standing in the drawing-room, evening light falling through the windows in slanted bars. I have, Alara said quietly. Dr. Hartwell says there is nothing wrong. That sometimes these things simply take time. Time. Arthur's jaw tightened. We are running out of time, Alara. She wanted to scream at him that it wasn't her fault, that she couldn't will a child into being, that she was trying, God, she was trying so hard. But she had learned not to raise her voice in Ashbourne manner. Emotion was unseemly. Distress was weakness. So she simply nodded and said, I understand. He left the room without another word. That night, alone in her too large bed, Alara stared at the ceiling and wondered if this was all her life would ever be. A series of empty rooms and emptier silences, a marriage that was a contract and nothing more, a future measured only in her failures. She thought of her mother in the village, already ill though no one knew it yet, believing her daughter was safe and settled. Believing the sacrifice had been worth it. Elara pressed her face into the pillow and wept as quietly as she'd learned to do everything else in this house that would never be a home. The coach that came for Elara was not the sterling carriage with its gleaming lacquer and ducal crest. It was a hired conveyance, shabby and listing to one side, driven by a man who wouldn't meet her eyes when Mr. Pembroke handed him the fare. The solicitor had arrived at dawn with papers for her to sign, a small purse of coins, and an address written in precise legal script on cream paper that already felt like an accusation. Blackwater Cottage, he'd said, not unkindly but not warmly either. On the coast near Winterhaven. The property belongs to a distant cousin of His Grace. It has been, and used for some years. But it will provide adequate shelter. Adequate. The word had struck her like a slap. 3 years ago, she had been the Duchess of Ashbourne. Now she was being measured by adequacy. The servants had gathered in the entrance hall as she descended the stairs for the last time, her few belongings packed into a single trunk that Thomas, the footman, carried with careful dignity. Mrs. Blackwood pressed a bundle wrapped in cloth into her hands. "Bread and cheese, my lady," the housekeeper whispered, her eyes red-rimmed. "And some apples from the orchard. It's a long journey." "Thank you," Elara managed, though her throat felt too tight for words. She wanted to tell them she was sorry for failing them, for not giving the estate the heir it needed, for being the Duchess who couldn't secure their futures. But what good were apologies now? The rain that had begun at her mother's funeral had never truly stopped. It followed her like a curse as the coach lurched away from Ashbourne Manor, through the gates she'd entered as a bride, past the village where people ducked into doorways rather than watch her leave. She pressed her face to the rain-streaked window and watched her old life dissolve into grey mist. The journey took 2 days. They stopped at coaching inns where the proprietors looked at her plain dress and worn cloak with suspicion, at the modest coins she counted out with barely concealed contempt. No one recognized her, and why would they? Duchesses didn't travel alone in hired coaches. Duchesses didn't count their pennies or sleep in rooms where the rain leaked through the ceiling. She was no longer a duchess. She was nothing. On the second night, at an inn that smelled of and stale beer, a merchant's wife struck up conversation at the communal table. "Traveling alone, dear. That's brave of you. Or foolish. Where's your husband, then?" Elara's fingers tightened around her spoon. "I am recently widowed." The lie came easily. It felt truer than the reality, that her husband had divorced her at her mother's grave, that she'd been cast out like spoiled goods, that the marriage she believed in had been nothing but a business arrangement that had failed to deliver its promised returns. "Oh, you poor lamb," the woman said, but her eyes were already losing interest, already scanning the room for more promising conversation. The third morning brought them to the coast. Elara smelled the salt air before she saw the water, felt the wind change from the stale breath of moorland to something wild and sharp that tasted of freedom and desolation in equal measure. The coach crested a hill, and suddenly the sea spread before her, grey and churning under a sky the color of iron. "Blackwater Cottage," the driver announced, pointing with his whip toward a structure that made Elara's heart sink. It wasn't a cottage. It was barely a house. The building crouched against the cliff like something trying to hide from the wind, its stone walls stained with damp, its roof missing more slates than it retained. One shutter hung at an angle, banging rhythmically against the wall. The garden, if it had ever been one, was now a tangle of weeds and wild grass bent nearly horizontal by the constant wind. The driver deposited her trunk on the muddy path and departed before she could gather her thoughts, the coach rattling away as if afraid the place's misfortune might be contagious. Elara stood alone with the wind tearing at her cloak and the rain beginning again, staring at what remained of her life. Behind her, the road stretched back toward everything she'd lost. Before her, a door that might not even open. She picked up her trunk, lighter than it should have been, holding so little of what she'd once possessed, and walked toward the cottage. The door was swollen with damp and resisted her push, but she shoved harder, and it gave way with a groan that sounded almost human. Inside, the air smelled of mold and mouse droppings and years of abandonment. Cobwebs hung from the low beams like funeral shrouds. The single room held a rusted stove, a table missing one leg, and a pallet that had clearly housed more than one generation of rodents. This was adequate shelter. This was what a failed duchess deserved. Heir set down her trunk and closed the door against the wind. Then, finally alone with no servants to witness, no society to judge, no husband to disappoint, she sank to the filthy floor and let herself break completely, her sobs lost in the sound of the sea battering itself against the cliffs below. The sickness came in the mornings, violent and relentless. At first, Heir blamed the cottage itself, the damp, the mold, the cold that seeped into her bones no matter how she fed the temperamental stove. She blamed the exhaustion of grief, the shock of her expulsion, the meager meals she cobbled together from Mrs. Blackwood's provisions and what little she could afford from the suspicious shopkeeper in Winterhaven village. But as the days turned to weeks, as her body continued its rebellion against food and daylight and any attempt at normalcy, a different fear began to creep into her awareness. A fear she pushed away each time it surfaced, because hope had proven too dangerous to hold. It was Mrs. Creel who finally named what Heir couldn't bring herself to acknowledge. The midwife had appeared at her door on a morning when Heir had been too weak to rise from her pallet, when the nausea had kept her curled around herself like a wounded animal. She'd heard the knock but couldn't answer it, and somehow the old woman had let herself in anyway, bringing with her the smell of dried herbs and a sharp, assessing gaze that saw too much. "Found you yesterday," Mrs. Creel said without preamble, setting down a basket that clinked with glass bottles. "Collapsed by the well. Young Thomas from the village brought you back, said you were white as death. I told him I'd check on you." "I'm fine," Heir whispered, though even speaking made her stomach lurch. "Just a fever. It will pass." It'll pass." Mrs. Creel's weathered hands were surprisingly gentle as she helped Heir sit up, held a cup of something bitter to her lips. "In about 6 months, I'd wager." The words hung in the damp air between them. Heir's hands went instinctively to her stomach, flat still beneath her nightgown, and she felt the world tilt sideways. "No. That's not possible. I can't be. When was your last courses, girl?" Heir opened her mouth, then closed it. She tried to remember, counting backward through the fog of grief and displacement. The funeral had been in early March. Before that, her mother's final illness in February. And before that. December, she breathed. "But that's not, I'm barren." The physician said. "Physicians." Mrs. Creel made a sound of disgust. "Men in fancy coats who wouldn't know a pregnancy if it birthed itself in front of them. Let me see you properly." What followed was an examination both clinical and kind, Mrs. Creel's hands pressing gently at Heir's abdomen, asking questions Heir answered in a daze. When had the sickness started? Was she tender here, or here? Had she noticed any other changes, however small? Finally, the midwife sat back on her heels, a grim satisfaction on her weathered face. 3 months gone, near as I can tell. Maybe a bit more. The babe's well positioned, strong from what I can feel. You're carrying right proper, just didn't show it yet because you're thin as a rail and tight-laced besides. Heir stared at her, unable to process the words into meaning. Pregnant. She was pregnant. With Arthur's child. With the heir he'd wanted so desperately that he divorced her for failing to provide it. The irony was so vicious it stole her breath. I need to tell him, she heard herself say. I need to go back. He doesn't know. And why would you do that? Mrs. Creel's voice turned sharp. Go crawling back to the man who threw you out. Who shamed you at your own mother's grave. But this is his son. His heir. The dukedom. The dukedom can rot. The old woman gripped Alara's shoulders, forcing her to meet her eyes. Listen to me, girl. You go back now, he'll take that babe the moment it's born and toss you aside again. Men like that, they don't want wives. They want brood mares and heirs and property they can control. Is that what you want for your child? To be raised by a man who sees love as a contract. Alara's hands pressed against her stomach, feeling nothing yet but knowing something impossible and precious was growing there. A child. Her child. Made in those cold, dutiful encounters in the manor's darkness, but hers nonetheless. What do I do? She whispered. Mrs. Creel's expression softened. You survive, same as every woman who's come before you. You eat properly, I'll bring you bone broth and iron tonics. You rest when the sickness takes you. You let your body do what it knows how to do. And when the time comes, you bring this babe into the world and you decide then what kind of life you want to give it. I have nothing to give it, Alara said, hearing the despair in her own voice. No money, no name, no future. Just this falling down cottage and a mother who couldn't even keep her husband. You have yourself, Mrs. Creel said firmly. And sometimes, girl, that's the most valuable thing a child can inherit. Not a title. Not a manor. But a mother who fights. After the midwife left, Alara sat in the weak sunlight filtering through the cottage's grimy window, her hands still pressed to her stomach. Inside her, cells divided and multiplied, forming fingers and toes and a heart that beat separate from her own. A boy, she thought, though she couldn't say why she was certain. A son who would have Arthur's dark eyes and sharp jaw, who would be heir to everything his father valued. But he would also be hers. The sea crashed against the cliffs below, relentless and wild and free. For the first time since the funeral, since the annulment, since her whole world had crumbled to ash, Alara felt something kindle in her chest that wasn't grief or despair. It felt dangerously like hope. And beneath it, deeper and more fierce, the primal determination of a mother who would die before she let anyone take her child away. The first thing Alara learned was that gentlewomen's hands were useless for real work. The blisters came within hours of trying to repair the cottage's sagging shutters, then again when she attempted to clear the choked garden plot behind the house. Her palms, soft from 3 years of drawing-room embroidery and tea pouring, split and bled until Mrs. Creel brought salve and wrapped them in cloth torn from old petticoats. You'll develop calluses, the midwife said matter-of-factly. All women do, when they stop pretending to be porcelain. Winter settled over the coast like a gray blanket, and Alara stopped pretending. She learned to coax fire from damp wood, to stretch a loaf of bread across 3 days, to mend her own clothes with uneven stitches that would have horrified Ashbourne's seamstress but kept the cold out well enough. The nausea faded as autumn gave way to winter, replaced by a hunger so fierce she sometimes dreamed of food more vividly than she'd ever dreamed of anything at the manor. The villagers of Winterhaven watched her at first with suspicion and curiosity in equal measure. A gentlewoman alone, cast out from somewhere, clearly ruined in some way that made her both tragic and slightly scandalous. But Mrs. Creel had claimed her, and in a village where the midwife's word carried more weight than any title, that protection mattered. "She's a widow," Mrs. Creel told anyone who asked, and sometimes those who didn't. "Lost her husband to fever. The cottage belonged to his family. She's making a go of it, brave girl." It was Thomas, the young fisherman who'd found Alara collapsed by the well, who first offered real help. He appeared one morning with a basket of fish, still silvery and fresh, and wouldn't take payment. "You look half-starved," he said, not unkindly. "And winter's hard on the coast. No shame in accepting what's freely given." After that, others followed. Sarah from the bakery brought bread that hadn't sold, claiming it would only go stale. Old Mr. Hendricks, who kept the general store, allowed Alara to barter mending work for lamp oil and tea. And gradually, as her belly began to swell beneath her loosened dresses, the village women drew her into their circle with the particular tenderness reserved for expectant mothers. They taught her things the Duchess had never needed to know. How to salt fish for keeping, how to recognize which cliff plants were edible and which would kill you, how to read the sky for coming storms. Margaret, a farmer's wife with 6 children of her own, showed her how to knit, and soon Alara's evenings were spent by the fire making small garments from wool. Margaret brought her, each tiny booty and cap a promise of the life growing inside her. "When are you due?" Margaret asked one afternoon, her practiced eye assessing Alara's silhouette. "May," Alara said. "Early May, Mrs. Creel thinks. A spring baby. That's good luck." Margaret's hands moved steadily through her own knitting, creating a blanket from scraps of yarn in a dozen different colors. "This is for you. Every mother needs a birthing blanket, and every baby needs to be welcomed proper." Alara's throat tightened. At Ashbourne, an heir would have been welcomed with ancestral christening gowns and silver rattles, with announcements in the Times and celebrations that lasted days. Her son would enter the world wrapped in a blanket of charity scraps, born to a mother with no name and no prospects. And yet, holding that blanket, feeling its warmth and seeing the care in every uneven stitch, Alara thought it might be the most valuable thing she'd ever been given. Her body changed as winter deepened. The gentle swell became unmistakable, her movements slower but somehow more purposeful. She felt the baby move for the first time in January, a flutter like butterfly wings that made her gasp and press her hand to her stomach in wonder. By February, the movements were stronger, little kicks and rolls that came most often at night when she lay in her narrow bed listening to the sea. She talked to him in those quiet hours, this child who would be born into poverty but also into freedom. She told him about his grandmother, about the village that had become more of a home than any manor, about the strength he would need to survive in a world that wouldn't grant him the privileges his father's name could have provided. "But you'll be loved," she whispered into the darkness. "Whatever else you lack, you'll never doubt that you're loved." The cottage, through her labor, transformed. The garden plot, cleared and prepared, waited for spring planting. The roof, patched with Thomas's help, no longer leaked in every corner. The walls, scrubbed and whitewashed, gleamed in the weak winter light. It was still small, still humble, still perched precariously on a cliff above a cold sea. But it was hers. On a clear March morning, with the baby sitting heavy and low and Mrs. Creel predicting he'd come early, Alara stood in her garden and felt the sun on her face. Her hands were calloused now, her dresses let out as far as they would go, her copper hair braided simply because elaborate arrangements were impossible without a lady's maid. She bore no resemblance to the Duchess who'd knelt in the mud at her mother's grave. And standing there, feeling her son move inside her and hearing Margaret call a greeting from the path, Alara realized she was glad. That woman had been trapped in porcelain, afraid to crack, afraid to show the strength she'd never known she possessed. This woman, worn and weathered and growing round with new life, was real. And real, she had learned, was infinitely more valuable than perfect. The storm began 3 days before the baby came, rolling in from the sea with a fury that made even the oldest villagers shake their heads and mutter about ill omens. Wind screamed around the cottage walls, tearing at the shutters Alara had so carefully repaired, and rain lashed the windows until the world outside became nothing but grey violence. Mrs. Creel arrived on the second day, dragging her birthing bag behind her and shaking water from her cloak like a dog. "I'm staying," she announced, brooking no argument. Babies dropped. "Could be tonight, could be tomorrow, but either way I'm not risking being caught on that path when your time comes." Alara was grateful for the company. The pains had started that morning, faint and irregular, like a promise of something inevitable drawing closer. She tried to keep herself busy, folding and refolding the tiny clothes she'd made, checking her supplies of clean linen, boiling water because Mrs. Creel said they'd need it, though Alara wasn't entirely sure why. The real labor began just after midnight, when the storm reached its peak. The first true contraction bent Alara double, stealing her breath and any illusion she'd had about being prepared. Mrs. Creel was there instantly, hands firm on her shoulders. "Breathe through it, girl. Just breathe. It'll pass, and then you'll have a moment before the next." But the moments between grew shorter, the pains longer and sharper until Alara lost all sense of time. The storm raged outside and inside her body alike, both forces of nature beyond her control. She walked when Mrs. Creel told her to walk, squatted when told to squat, gripped the bedpost and sobbed when the pain became a living thing trying to tear her apart from the inside. "I can't," she gasped at some point when the darkness beyond the window might have been late night or early morning. "I can't do this." "You are doing it," Mrs. Creel said firmly. "You're already doing it, and you'll keep doing it because that baby needs to be born and you're the only one who can birth him. Now stop your nonsense and push when I tell you to push." Hours blurred together. The storm and her body became one rhythm, waves crashing against the cliffs below echoing the waves of agony crashing through her. She understood, dimly, why women died doing this. Why it was called labor, as if any work she'd done in her life could compare to this primal, exhausting, terrifying act of bringing life into the world. "I see the head," Mrs. Creel said, and there was excitement in her voice now. "One more push, Alara. One more good push and you'll have your son." Alara bore down with everything she had left, a sound tearing from her throat that was barely human, and suddenly the pressure released and there was crying, not her own, but high and indignant and utterly, perfectly alive. "A boy," Mrs. Creel said, and she was laughing, wrapping the tiny squalling thing in Margaret's patchwork blanket. "A fine, healthy boy. Look at him, Alara. Look at your son." She placed the baby on Alara's chest, and the world narrowed to just this, the warm weight of him, the surprising strength of his tiny fists, the way his crying quieted when he felt her heartbeat. He was red and wrinkled and covered in vernix, his dark hair plastered to his skull, and he was the most beautiful thing Alara had ever seen. "Hello," she whispered, touching his impossibly small fingers. "Hello, little one. I'm your mama." The baby's eyes opened, dark and unfocused, and Alara's breath caught. Even newborn, even barely minutes old, she could see Arthur in his face, the shape of his jaw, the set of his eyes, the way his tiny brow furrowed with what looked like concentration. This was the heir Arthur had wanted so desperately. The son who should have been born in Ashbourne Manor with physicians attending and the family gathered to witness the continuation of their line. Instead, he'd been born in a storm, in a cottage that leaked, delivered by a village midwife while his father courted a replacement bride who would give him legitimate children to erase the failure of his first marriage. "What will you call him?" Mrs. Creel asked, cleaning up with the efficient movements of someone who'd done this 100 times. Elara looked down at her son, at his perfect face and searching eyes, and thought of all the sterling names she'd learned during her time at the manor. The traditional names passed down through generations, each one carrying the weight of history and expectation. Arthur's grandfather had been Nathaniel. His father, Edmund. Arthur himself was named for a king. Julian, she said softly. His name is Julian. It meant youthful, vigorous, downy-bearded. It was a name that belonged to no sterling ancestor she knew of. It was a name she'd chosen because she liked the sound of it, because it felt like hope and new beginnings rather than the crushing weight of legacy. Julian, Mrs. Creel repeated, nodding approval. It's a good name. Strong. Outside, the storm was breaking. The wind's howl softened to a moan, and through the window, Elara could see the first hint of dawn lightening the sky. The world had survived the night's violence. So had she. So had her son. Julian made a small sound, mouth working, and Mrs. Creel helped Elara position him to nurse. The sensation was strange and uncomfortable at first, but then he latched on with surprising determination, and Elara felt something settle in her chest that might have been peace. She traced the line of his cheek, memorizing every detail. Yes, he had Arthur's face, Arthur's coloring, Arthur's blood. But he had her courage, her survival, her love. And that, she decided, made him entirely hers. The invitation arrived in June, forwarded through Mr. Pembroke's office with a note so brief it might have been an afterthought. The Ashbourne Summer Masquerade, an annual tradition Arthur's family had hosted for generations, would take place on the 23rd. As the Duke's former wife, Elara was entitled to attend if she wished, though the solicitor's tone suggested he expected she wouldn't. He was wrong. Elara stood in the cottage with Julian sleeping in the cradle Thomas had built, the cream invitation trembling in her hands, and felt something crystallize in her chest that had been forming since the day her son was born. Arthur was going to announce his engagement to Lady Genevieve at the masquerade. Mrs. Creel had heard it from a traveling merchant, who'd heard it from a servant at the manor. The whole county knew. The whole county would be there to witness the Duke finally securing his heir through a proper marriage. Except he already had an heir. You're thinking something dangerous, Mrs. Creel said from the doorway, her knowing eyes missing nothing. I'm thinking, Elara said slowly, that Arthur should meet his son. And that Lady Genevieve should know exactly what kind of man she's agreeing to marry. The journey to London took 3 days, Julian bundled against her chest in a sling Margaret had fashioned. He was a good traveler, quiet and observant, his dark eyes taking in the changing landscape with what seemed like inherited sterling curiosity. Elara had sold the last of her mother's silver to pay for the coach fare and a room in a modest inn near Mayfair. She had enough left for one good dress. The dressmaker looked at her with thinly veiled skepticism when Elara explained what she needed, something suitable for a masquerade but nothing too expensive. The woman's expression shifted when Elara produced her mother's jewelry from its worn velvet case, a sapphire necklace and matching earrings, old-fashioned but genuine, the only valuable things her mother hadn't sold to pay the debts. These will do nicely, the dressmaker murmured, her assessment of Elara visibly changing. And I think I have something that might suit. The dress was midnight blue silk, simple in cut but elegant, with a neckline designed to showcase the sapphires. It had been made for another client who'd never collected it, and it fit Elara's post-birth figure almost perfectly. She barely recognized herself in the mirror, no longer the gaunt exile or the laboring mother, but something else entirely. A woman with a purpose. The night of the masquerade, Elara left Julian with the innkeeper's wife, a grandmother who'd clucked over him with practiced affection and promised to care for him as her own. She wore a silver mask that covered the upper half of her face, her copper hair arranged in a style that echoed her duchess days but simpler, held with her mother's pearl combs. Ashbourne House blazed with light, music spilling from the open windows into the warm June night. Carriages lined the street, livery servants attending to guests in their finest silks and jewels. Elara's hands shook as she presented her invitation at the door, but the footman barely glanced at it before waving her through. Inside, the ballroom was a glittering spectacle. Hundreds of candles reflected off mirrors and crystal, the masked guests moving in elaborate patterns across the polished floor. Elara pressed herself against a column, watching, searching. She found Arthur near the terrace doors, distinguished even behind his black mask. Lady Genevieve hung on his arm, resplendent in rose silk, laughing at something one of Arthur's friends had said. They looked perfect together, matched in breeding, in beauty, in the effortless confidence of people who'd never doubted their place in the world. Elara's resolve almost wavered. What was she doing here? What did she think would happen? Then the orchestra finished its piece, and Arthur raised his hand for attention. The room quieted, guests turning expectantly toward their host. This was it, the announcement that would seal Elara's erasure, that would give another woman the position she'd held, that would let Arthur pretend his first marriage had never happened. Elara stepped forward. She moved through the crowd with steady purpose, her mask both shield and weapon. People parted without knowing why, perhaps sensing the determination in her bearing. She reached the edge of the cleared space where Arthur stood just as he began to speak. "My friends, I'm grateful you've joined me tonight to celebrate." "To celebrate what, Your Grace?" Elara's voice cut through the room, clear and sharp. "Another marriage built on convenient lies?" The music stopped. Every head turned. Arthur's words died in his throat as he finally, truly looked at her. She saw the moment recognition struck, saw his face go pale behind the mask, saw Lady Genevieve's confusion, saw the ripple of shock spread through the assembled guests. Elara. Her name was barely a whisper. "You can't be here." "I can." She removed her mask slowly, letting everyone see her face, letting them remember who she'd been. "I have something that belongs to you, Arthur. Something you wanted more than anything else in the world." She produced the miniature portrait from her reticule, Julian's face painted by a traveling artist in Winterhaven, his dark eyes and strong features unmistakably sterling even at 3 months old. "Your heir," she said, holding it up for the room to see. "Your son. Born in May, healthy and perfect and bearing your face as clearly as any legitimacy could demand." The silence that followed was absolute. Arthur stared at the portrait, his hand reaching out unconsciously before dropping to his side. Lady Genevieve made a small sound of distress. And Elara stood in the center of the ballroom that had once been hers, watching the carefully constructed world of Arthur Sterling begin to crack apart. "I wasn't barren," she said softly, but every word carried in the breathless hush. "I was simply married to a man too cold to create life until he'd already destroyed it." The ballroom erupted into chaos. Voices rose in shock and speculation, fans snapping open to shield scandalized whispers, and somewhere a woman laughed with the sharp edge of vindication. Lady Genevieve's mother was speaking in rapid, furious tones to her daughter, already calculating the social damage, already preparing their retreat. But Arthur heard none of it. He stood frozen, staring at the miniature portrait in Elara's hand, and felt the foundations of his carefully ordered world crack beneath him. That face. That impossibly small face with its dark eyes and serious expression, it was his own face looking back at him from infancy. The same strong brow his grandfather had possessed, the same set to the jaw that appeared in every sterling portrait lining the manor's halls. This wasn't some clever forgery or desperate claim. This was his blood, his legacy, the heir he'd craved with such single-minded obsession that he destroyed his marriage for lack of one. Let me see him. The words came out strangled, barely recognizable as his own voice. The child. I need to see him. Ilara's expression didn't soften. Why? So you can take him. So you can do to him what you did to me, reduce him to a transaction, a means to an end? Ilara, please. Your Grace, Lady Genevieve's voice cut through, high and trembling. Surely this woman is mistaken. Some unfortunate resemblance, perhaps, or... She's not mistaken. Arthur couldn't look away from the portrait, from the irrefutable evidence of his catastrophic error. That's my son. Lady Genevieve's face drained of color. Her mother gripped her arm, speaking in urgent whispers, but the girl shook her head, something like horror dawning in her eyes. You divorced her. You humiliated her at her mother's funeral. Everyone knows what you did. I thought, Arthur's throat closed. What had he thought? That Ilara was barren because 3 years wasn't enough time. That the failure to conceive was entirely her fault, some deficiency in her body rather than the cold, mechanical nature of their encounters. That he could simply discard one wife and acquire another like replacing a broken tool. You thought wrong, Ilara said, her voice cutting through his spiraling thoughts. About everything. The room had gone quiet again, everyone watching this domestic tragedy unfold like spectators at a public execution. Arthur felt their eyes on him, felt the weight of judgment he'd never before experienced, and something in his chest began to splinter. Where is he? Arthur asked, taking a step toward Ilara. My son. Where is Julian? Her eyes flashed. How do you know his name? It's written on the back of the portrait. He had memorized every detail in those few seconds, desperate for any scrap of information about this child he'd never known existed. Julian. It suits him. It's not a sterling name, Ilara said, and there was defiance in her tone. He doesn't carry your name at all. He's Julian Vance. My son. Raised in a cottage by the sea with people who love him for himself, not for what he represents. The words hit Arthur like physical blows. His son, his heir, didn't even bear his name. Would grow up knowing his father had cast aside his mother before his birth. Would learn that the Duke of Ashbourne had valued contracts and bloodlines over the woman who tried so desperately to please him. I need to see him, Arthur said again, and this time his voice broke completely. Please, Ilara. Let me see what I've done. What you've done. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. You've done exactly what you intended, Arthur. You discarded a wife you deemed useless and moved on to better prospects. The only miscalculation was that I wasn't actually barren, just married to a man whose coldness made conception nearly impossible. Lady Genevieve made a soft sound of distress. Arthur turned to find her backing away, her mother's hand firm on her elbow. I cannot marry you, Genevieve said, her voice shaking but resolute. Not after this. Not knowing what you're capable of. Lady Genevieve, please. My daughter is quite right, the Countess said icily. Whatever understanding we had is dissolved. Come, Genevieve. We're leaving. They swept from the ballroom, and with them went any pretense of Arthur's carefully managed future. The other guests began to follow, eager to escape the wreckage and even more eager to spread the story. The Duke of Ashbourne, undone by his own cruelty. The discarded wife returning with proof of his mistake. It would be the scandal of the season. Soon, only Arthur and Elara remained in the vast ballroom, surrounded by abandoned champagne glasses and the dying light of 100 candles. "I'm staying at the Rose and Crown," Elara said quietly. "Room 12. If you want to meet your son, come tomorrow at noon." "But Arthur," she paused, her eyes meeting his with something that might have been pity. "If you come, it's not to claim him. It's not to take him away from me. It's to understand what you threw away." She left him there, her midnight blue skirts whispering across the floor, her mother's sapphires catching the light one last time before she disappeared through the terrace doors. Arthur stood alone in the wreckage of his perfectly planned evening and felt something inside him shatter completely. He sank to his knees on the polished floor where moments ago he'd been about to announce his triumph, and for the first time since childhood, he wept. Not for the lost engagement or the social ruin or even the scandal that would follow him for years. But for the wife he'd broken, the son he'd never held, and the man he'd become in pursuit of a legacy that now felt hollow as an empty title. Arthur arrived at the Rose and Crown at 1:45, unable to wait any longer. He'd spent the night walking London streets, his evening clothes drawing stares and whispers, his mind replaying every cold word he'd ever spoken to Elara, every calculation he'd made that had treated her as a failure rather than a person. The innkeeper's wife directed him upstairs with a look that suggested she knew exactly who he was and what he'd done. Room 12 was at the end of a narrow hall, and Arthur stood before the door for a full minute, hand raised to knock, paralyzed by the knowledge that everything that mattered in his life now existed on the other side of this threshold. Elara opened the door before he could knock, as if she'd been watching for him. She wore a simple dress of cream muslin, her copper hair loose around her shoulders the way he'd never seen it at the manor, and she looked more beautiful than he remembered. More real. "Come in," she said quietly. "But take off your boots. He's sleeping." Arthur removed his boots with trembling hands and followed her inside. The room was small but clean, afternoon sunlight streaming through lace curtains. And there, in a basket lined with blankets, lay his son. Julian was perfect. 3 months old, with dark hair that curled slightly at the temples and skin like porcelain. He slept with one tiny fist curled near his face, his chest rising and falling with the gentle rhythm of infant breathing. Arthur had seen babies before, tenants' children, servants' offspring, but none of them had been his. None of them had carried his blood, his features, or his legacy. None of them had been born because he'd been too blind to see what he already had. "May I?" Arthur's voice caught. "May I hold him?" Elara studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she nodded and carefully lifted Julian from the basket. The baby stirred, making a small sound of protest before settling again. She placed him in Arthur's arms with a warning, "Support his head." The weight was nothing and everything. Arthur looked down at his son's face and felt the last remnants of his old self crumble away. This was what he'd wanted. This was what he'd destroyed his marriage for, what he'd humiliated Elara to obtain. And he'd had it all along, if only he'd been capable of warmth instead of contracts, love instead of duty. "He has your eyes," Elara said softly. "Even the way he looks at things, like he's measuring and calculating. But he has my mother's smile. You'll see it when he wakes." Arthur couldn't speak. Tears ran down his face unchecked as Julian's eyes opened, dark and serious and already so wise, and looked at him with what might have been curiosity or judgment or simply the innocent gaze of an infant who didn't yet know his father was a monster. "I'm sorry," Arthur whispered, though he didn't know if he was speaking to Julian or to Elara or to both. "I'm so sorry for what I've done." "Sorry doesn't undo it," Elara said, but her voice wasn't cruel. Just honest. Sorry doesn't give me back the months I spent thinking I was worthless. Sorry doesn't erase the humiliation or the exile or the nights I went hungry because I had to choose between food and fuel. I know. Arthur carefully returned Julian to her arms, afraid he might somehow damage this precious thing. But I want to try. To make amends. To be better than I was. How? It was a simple question with no simple answer. Arthur had thought about nothing else since the masquerade. Ashbourne Manor, he said slowly. I'm selling it. The estate, the title, I'll retain the dukedom legally, Julian is the heir, but the property itself will go to my cousin. The money will go into a trust for Julian's future and to repay every penny you should have had. Ilara's eyes widened. You can't sell Ashbourne. It's been in your family for centuries. I know. Arthur felt strangely light saying it aloud. But it made me into someone who could throw away his wife at her mother's grave. Someone who valued legacy over love. I don't want Julian growing up in that house, learning to be that man. What will you do? Whatever you'll allow me to do. Arthur met her eyes, seeing for the first time not the disappointment or the ghost, but the woman he'd been too blind to love when he had the chance. I know I can't undo what I've done. I know I don't deserve forgiveness. But if you'll let me, I want to know my son. I want to be the father he deserves, not the one I would have been. Ilara was quiet for so long Arthur thought she might refuse. Then she said, there's a cottage. By the sea. It needs work, but it has good bones. It's where Julian was born, where I learned who I actually am beneath the Duchess facade. I'd like to see it, Arthur said. If you'll show me. 6 months later, the scandal had faded to gossip, and Arthur Sterling stood on the cliffs above Winterhaven with his son in his arms and his wife, remarried in a small ceremony with only the village attending, at his side. Julian was nearly a year old now, babbling at the seabirds and reaching for the sunlight on the water. The cottage behind them had been rebuilt from its foundations, expanded but not grand, comfortable but not ostentatious. A home, not a monument. Arthur had learned to work with his hands, to accept help from villagers who'd been skeptical of him at first but warmed when they saw how Ilara looked at him now, with trust hard-earned and carefully tended. He'll need a brother or sister eventually, Ilara said, leaning against Arthur's shoulder as Julian shrieked with delight at a passing gull. Arthur kissed the top of her head, breathing in the salt air and the scent of her hair. Only if you want one. Only if it's born from love, not obligation. She turned to look at him, and in her eyes he saw forgiveness that he'd spent months earning, love that had grown from the ruins of what they'd lost. Then yes, she said softly. I want one. The sea rolled in below them, endless and forgiving, washing away the past and leaving only the future, uncertain perhaps, but built on truth this time. On love that had survived cruelty and grown stronger for it. On a family that chose each other not from duty but from hope. Arthur looked at his wife, at his son, at the humble cottage that had become more of a home than any manor could ever be, and felt something he'd never experienced in all his years at Ashbourne. He felt worthy of what he'd been given. And that, finally, was enough. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to support the channel. I've got another great story lined up for you. Click the video on your screen now to watch it next. See you there.